This was not an act of mercy. This was not a desperate mother sending her stepdaughter to safety, wrapping the girl in some protective lie about a fresh start in a new place. This was not love disguised as discipline or sorrow dressed as tough medicine. This was calculated cruelty wrapped in the dusty veil of frontier propriety. A betrayal so profound that the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath when the deed was done. Vivian Caldwell, a woman whose smile never once reached her pale gray eyes, had signed away her stepdaughter's future as coldly as a banker stamps a foreclosure notice on a failing farm. She had packaged that betrayal inside a mail-order bride contract, addressed it to the most God-forsaken peak in all of Colorado territory, and handed it over with the theatrical sorrow of a woman who had practiced her performance in the mirror until every tremble of her lip looked genuine. The destination she had chosen was not random. Every woman in Silver Creek knew the name: Stone Mountain, the place where three brothers lived alone on a ridge so high that the air thinned and the trees twisted into shapes that looked like the hands of drowning men reaching for a sky that would never save them. Three men the townspeople called the Stone Devils. Three giants who came down from the mountain once a year for supplies, who spoke to no one who looked at the civilized world with amber eyes that held all the warmth of a January sunrise and twice the danger. Mothers used their names to frighten children into obedience. Merchants watched them with the nervous attention men reserve for grizzly bears browsing too close to the livestock. Vivian Caldwell did not need to hire an assassin. She did not need poison or a bullet or a hired blade in the dark. She only needed a pen, a contract, and the absolute certainty that sending Clara Whitfield to Stone Mountain was the same as burying her alive. If Clara survived up there, she would be entombed above the tree line beyond the reach of any judge, any lawyer, any human soul who might listen to her claims about forged documents and stolen land. If Clara died, it would be nothing more than another sad frontier tragedy, mourned briefly and forgotten quickly. Just one more young woman swallowed by the merciless wilderness of the Colorado high country. Either way, Vivian won. Before that morning of betrayal, before the world tilted on its cruel axis, Clara Whitfield had known a different kind of suffering. The slower kind. The kind that seeps in through locked doors and whispered conversations, and the systematic erasure of everything you thought was yours. The Whitfield Ranch sprawled at the foot of the San Juan Range, where the land cracked like old leather under the relentless sun. It had once been a kingdom of childhood wonder. Clara remembered running through fields of wild sage with the mountains towering above her, like cathedral walls built by God himself. She remembered the smell of leather and coffee and wood smoke that clung to every room of the main house. She remembered her father, Thomas Whitfield, a man whose hands were rough as pine bark, but whose eyes held the softness of morning light filtering through mesquite branches. He was not a gentleman in the way that city people understood gentleness. He was frontier gentle, which meant he could shoot a rattlesnake at 40 yards and then sit down beside his daughter and read to her from a book of poetry with the same steady hands. He could drive a cattle deal that left the other party feeling grateful for losing, and then spend an evening teaching Clara how to read a balance sheet, how to spot fraud in a textile trade, how to calculate interest rates and land values with the precision of a Philadelphia banker. Thomas Whitfield did not teach his daughter the things women were expected to learn in 1873. He did not teach her embroidery or piano or the delicate art of attracting a suitable husband. He taught her arithmetic. He taught her how to read a contract and find the lie hiding between the clauses. He taught her how to examine a bolt of cloth and know within 3 seconds whether it was pure wool or a cotton blend being sold at 5 times its actual worth. He had been cheated once by a supplier from the East, a man who sold cotton, mixed fabric at pure wool prices. And Thomas Whitfield had sworn that no one in his family would ever be cheated that way again. But the most important thing Thomas gave his daughter was something she would not understand the value of until years later, when a child's life hung in the balance on a mountain ledge, and the only thing standing between that child and death was knowledge written in a dead man's hand. Thomas shared with Clara the medical journals of her grandfather, Dr. James Whitfield, a battlefield surgeon who had served in the Mexican War. Those leather-bound books were filled with anatomical drawings rendered in precise ink with step-by-step instructions for treating field injuries when no proper doctor was available. Compound fractures, gunshot wounds, infections, how to suture a wound with a curved needle and silk thread, How to set a broken bone by feel when the flesh was too swollen to see. How to prevent shock. How to save a life with nothing but boiling water, clean cloth, straight sticks, and the stubborn refusal to let a patient die. Clara had read those journals by firelight during long winter evenings, fascinated by the clinical precision and the practical wisdom they contained. She read them the way other girls read adventure novels, with wide eyes and a racing heart, and no understanding whatsoever that she was studying for the most important examination of her life. Thomas also kept a secret he never told Clara directly. Before marrying Vivian Caldwell, he had drawn up a will, clear as mountain water, unambiguous as a rifle shot. The will left everything to his only daughter, Clara Rose Whitfield. Every acre of grazing land, every water right, every army supply contract that paid in reliable government silver. The will specified that any future wife would receive support only if she acted as faithful guardian to Clara's interests until the girl reached majority. There were notary seals, witness signatures from prominent Silver Creek businessmen. And most dangerous of all, the will contained detailed descriptions of property boundaries that matched the original territorial surveys, not the modified versions that would later be filed by corrupted officials working at Vivian Caldwell's direction. Thomas, understanding both the power of law and the weakness of men, had deposited a duplicate copy of the will with the town banker, Thaddeus Hartley. Along with that duplicate, Thomas left a personal letter dated 3 days before the will itself, explaining in lucid and careful language his concerns about his new wife's intentions and his desire to protect his daughter from what he called with devastating precision potential predation. He also entrusted one more safeguard to a man whose loyalty had been tested by decades of honest service. Ezekiel Moss, 65 years old, Thomas's personal servant and the closest thing to a grandfather Clara had ever known. Thomas gave Ezekiel simple instructions. If anything should happen, if Clara should ever need proof, Ezekiel would know what to do. Then the sickness came. Thomas lay in his bed in the room overlooking the eastern pastures, his body shaking like autumn leaves in a wind that would not stop. The fever ate him from the inside. It turned the strongest man Clara had ever known into something fragile and translucent, like paper held up to firelight. In his final hours, he pressed her small hand between his calloused palms and whispered promises. She would inherit everything he had built from dust and determination. She would be protected. She would be safe. Those promises died with him. And the vulture who had been circling overhead for months finally landed. Vivian Caldwell had arrived in Silver Creek 3 years earlier on the afternoon stage from St. Louis, carrying trunks full of silken secrets. She was beautiful in the way that winter is beautiful, striking and cold and harboring the threat of something deadly beneath the surface. Her marriage to Thomas had been brief and transactional, devoid of the warmth that frontier families relied upon to survive the isolation. Thomas needed a woman to manage the household. Vivian needed financial security with the desperation of someone who had once lost everything and sworn never to lose again. Because Vivian Caldwell had her own ghost story. Her father had been a prosperous merchant in St. Louis until the market crash of 1857 wiped him clean. Every dollar, every asset, every thread of social standing. Her mother had died of illness in poverty in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and broken dreams. Vivian had grown up in the wreckage of that destruction, watching the world through the eyes of a girl who understood at the age of 12 that money was the only wall between a woman and annihilation. She had sworn she would never be poor again. And she had kept that vow with the ruthless efficiency of a general executing a military campaign. After Thomas was laid beneath a simple wooden cross in the family plot, Vivian's mask of widowed sorrow fell away. She looked at Clara and saw not a grieving daughter but an obstacle. A number to be erased from the balance sheet. The transformation of the Whitfield Ranch happened with methodical precision. Vivian did not destroy everything at once. She was too intelligent for that. She operated with the patience of someone who had studied how institutions work, who understood that power was not about shouting, but about controlling the paperwork. First, the personnel. Thomas's loyal ranch hands were dismissed one by one. Not all at once, which would have been conspicuous, but gradually with plausible reasons attached to each departure. In their places came Vivian's people, rougher men with calculating eyes whose hands lingered too long on their gun belts, Men who answered to Vivian and reported every conversation, every movement, every shadow that passed across Clara's face. Second, the information. Thomas's personal effects were burned in the courtyard fire pit. Photographs, letters, old contracts. Anything bearing Thomas's handwriting that might be compared against the documents Vivian was now filing with territorial officials. Everything became ash and smoke, scattered by the wind into nothing. Third, the isolation. Clara was pushed from daughter of the house to something closer to a servant. Her room was reduced. Her meals were limited. Her freedom of movement was constrained by the silent presence of Vivian's men who watched her with the flat attention of hired guards. Vivian constructed a narrative for the town. Clara was suffering from grief. Clara was becoming unstable. Clara needed supervision, needed guidance, needed the firm hand of a loving stepmother who only wanted what was best for her poor, disturbed child. Clara was not stupid. She was Thomas Whitfield's daughter, and Thomas had not raised a fool. Among her father's old papers hidden in a leather-bound journal he kept in his study, she found notes about land deeds and legal documents that did not match what Vivian now claimed. The handwriting was wrong. The dates were suspicious. Her father had always been meticulous, his record-keeping as precise as his business dealings, and these discrepancies gnawed at Clara like a persistent ache. She said nothing. She observed. She waited for the right moment to understand what she had discovered. That moment never came. Vivian struck first. On a blistering afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer like water over hot stone, Vivian summoned Clara to the parlor. She wore her performance face, concerned brow, trembling hands, a voice pitched perfectly between maternal worry and reluctant authority. She announced loud enough for the remaining household to hear that Clara had become uncontrollable, that her grief had curdled into dangerous rebellion, that for everyone's safety she had arranged a fresh start for the girl, a mail-order bride contract with a respectable rancher in the mountains. The words were poison wrapped in silk. A fresh start, a new life, a respectable rancher. What Vivian meant was Stone Mountain. What she meant was 3 men the entire territory feared. What she meant was permanent exile to a place so remote that Clara might as well be buried in the earth itself. In the hours before dawn, something happened that Vivian Caldwell never knew about. Ezekiel Moss, the old servant, could not stop the betrayal. He was 65 and frail and outnumbered by Vivian's hired men in every way that mattered. But Thomas had given him instructions, and Ezekiel Moss was a man who kept his word, the way the mountains keep the snow. While Clara slept her last night in her father's house, Ezekiel worked by candlelight with steady hands and a heavy heart. He took the original copy of Thomas's will, rolled it tight, wrapped it in waxed cloth to keep out moisture, and sewed it into the hem of Clara's navy blue traveling dress. The dress she would wear tomorrow. The dress that would carry her away from everything she had ever known. Hidden in the fold of that fabric was her future, her weapon, her proof. If Clara survived long enough to find it, the will would be her salvation. If she did not survive, then at least Ezekiel Moss could face his maker knowing he had tried. They put Clara on a wagon before sunrise. She was not bound. Vivian was too sophisticated for ropes. But 2 of her men flanked the girl on either side, and the look in their eyes communicated everything that ropes would have said. Run and see what happens. The journey lasted 2 days. 2 days of trails that grew narrower with every mile climbing higher, pushing further from any sign of civilization Clara had ever known. The trees changed as they climbed. Mesquite gave way to ponderosa pine. Pine gave way to thick stands of spruce that blocked out the sun and created a green twilight that felt like descending into a world that operated by different rules. The air thinned, the temperature dropped. The silence deepened into something that was not peaceful, but a heavy, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of creature was being delivered to its doorstep. Clara sat in the wagon, clutching the single small bag Vivian had allowed her to bring. She did not know about the will hidden in the hem of the dress she was wearing. She did not know that Ezekiel Moss was already being expelled from the ranch, that he would wander to Tucson and lie dying in a cheap boarding house, that he would spend his final weeks sending letters through fur traders and frontier runners until his message reached the mountains. She knew only that the world she had known was disappearing mile by mile behind her, and that ahead lay something she could not imagine and could not prepare for. She did not cry. She had spent her tears the night before lying in her bed for the last time in her father's house, listening to Vivian's laughter, drifting up from the parlor below, like the sound of breaking glass. The two men stopped at a junction point where the trail split, a clearing with some fallen trees and the remains of old campfires. They told Clara to get out, pointed up the trail that continued climbing into darkness. Stone Place is up that trail, about 3 miles. They are expecting a bride. That is you. Then they turned the wagon around and left. The sound of wheels and hoofbeats faded into the forest until there was nothing but wind and the distant call of a hawk riding the thermals above the tree line. Clara Whitfield stood alone in the wilderness. 5 feet 3 inches of navy blue silk and honey blonde hair, and cornflower blue eyes that held a spark which refused to dim even in the shadow of absolute abandonment. Behind her, the wagon tracks were already being erased by the wind. Her old life was being swept clean from the earth's memory. She could kneel down and weep. She could sit and wait for the wolves to find her. Or she could walk. She chose to walk, her legs shaking, her spine straight, following a trail into the unknown. The homestead appeared after the final bend like a fortress growing from the body of the mountain itself. It was not the rotting cabin Clara had imagined during those 2 days of climbing. It was a compound, a main house built from full pine logs 2 stories high, with a stone chimney that rose above the roofline like a granite finger pointing at the sky. A separate cookhouse, a stable large enough for a dozen horses, a fur storage shed, a tanning workshop that smelled of chemicals and dried meat, and something ancient that Clara could not identify. A windbreak fence circled the packed earth yard woven from willow branches in a pattern that flexed and whispered in the mountain breeze. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, carrying the scent of roasting meat and something sharp and herbal that made Clara's empty stomach clench with hunger. But the first thing Clara saw was not the buildings. It was a man. Caleb Stone stepped out of the stable, and every survival instinct in Clara's body sounded its alarm at once. He was taller than any man she had ever seen. She had to tilt her head back to look at his face the way a person tilts their head to look up at a cliff wall. His shoulders were broad as a barn gate. His skin was deep copper, burnished by decades under a sun that showed no mercy at this altitude. His jaw was square and hard, covered with 2 days of dark stubble that only made his features look more carved from stone than flesh. His nose was straight with a slight bump at the bridge, the memory of an old break. His lips were fuller than expected on such a hard face, a contradiction that Clara's mind registered without understanding. His eyes were amber, not brown. Amber, the color of whiskey held up to firelight, or of a wolf's gaze fixed on something it has not yet decided is prey or irrelevant. He was shirtless. His bare chest was a landscape of muscle built not by vanity, but by 20 years of labor that would have killed most men. Deep lines of definition across his abdomen. The thick cords of his arms. Scars told stories across his torso. An old rope burn on his forearm. A faded bullet graze across his left shoulder. A healed knife slash across his ribs that had faded to a thin silver line. Sweat shone on his tanned skin like morning dew on bronze. He stopped. He looked at her. He said nothing. The silence stretched long enough for Clara to hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then other footsteps. Josiah Stone emerged from the tree line carrying a dressed deer across his shoulders as if it weighed nothing at all. He was slightly shorter than Caleb, built leaner, constructed for speed and endurance rather than raw power. His dark blonde hair was pulled back and tied. His amber eyes were the same shade as his brother's, but deeper, more watchful, carrying the patient stillness of a hunter waiting for his quarry to make a mistake. He wore no shirt either. His torso was lean muscle over long bones scarred across the knuckles from a lifetime of knife work and trap setting. A blue bandana hung around his neck. Then Emmett Stone stepped out from the main house, the youngest. Auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire, tousled and wild. His frame was massive but carried differently than his brother's, more fluid. Built like a horseman rather than a laborer. His amber eyes were the warmest of the three, with lines at the corners that suggested he smiled more often than the other two. But that smile vanished the instant he saw Clara standing in the yard. 3 men, 3 giants, shirtless, scarred, amber-eyed, standing in a triangle formation around a girl in a dusty silk dress who looked as if the next strong wind might carry her away like a leaf. Clara opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The advertisement said one husband. Emmett was the only one who spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, the voice of a man who rarely talked to anyone outside his own blood. Advertisement said a bride for Stone Mountain. We are all Stone Mountain. Clara looked from Caleb to Josiah to Emmett. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But run where 2 days of mountain trip, but a mountain trail behind her led back to Vivian, where death waited, wearing a legal disguise instead of a wild one. At least on this mountain she had a chance. A small chance. A desperate chance. But a chance nonetheless. Caleb finally spoke. His voice was deep as distant thunder, and every word carried weight that could not be argued with. You are not a prisoner, but you are here. Make of it what you will. He turned and walked toward the house. Clara understood without translation. She could stand here until the cold took her, or she could follow. She chose to follow. Legs trembling but chin raised, trailing this terrifying stranger into the shadow of a pine log house, into the absolute unknown. Inside the house was warmer than she expected and darker. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, the fire within it burning low but steady. Animal pelts covered the floor and the furniture, which was rough-hewn but solid. Everything smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and something wild that Clara would later identify as the scent of lives lived entirely outdoors. And there beside the fireplace sat the woman who would decide whether Clara lived or died on this mountain. Opal Stone occupied a rocking chair like a queen occupies a throne. She was 72 years old. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each one earned through decades of survival at an altitude where every breath was a small victory. Her eyes were sharp as obsidian blades, dark and bright and missing nothing. Her back was straight, despite her years held upright by a will that apparently considered physical deterioration an opinion rather than a fact. She stood. Her joints cracked like dry branches, but her posture did not waver. She circled Clara slowly the way a horse trader circles a questionable animal at auction. She pinched the soft flesh of Clara's arms. She took Clara's hands and turned them over, examining palms that had known only the gentle resistance of embroidery needles and piano keys. She studied the girl's shoes, her dress, her hair, the cameo brooch at her throat with a thorough contempt of someone evaluating goods that had been misrepresented. Then she spoke. Her voice was like gravel dragged across iron, soft as fresh butter, will not last a month. Caleb responded with words that carried the weight of a command already issued, indicating this matter was not open for debate. Opal narrowed her eyes, studying her grandson with an expression that seemed to see through flesh to the motivations beneath. Something passed between them. Some negotiation conducted entirely in silence in the private language of a family that had survived together for 2 decades through stubbornness and blood. Finally, with a grunt that could have meant acceptance or resignation, Opal grabbed Clara's wrist and pulled her toward the kitchen area where clay vessels and stretchered hides waited for processing. The testing had begun. The first task Opal assigned was hauling water from a spring half a mile down the mountainside. Clara was given 2 heavy wooden buckets and pointed toward a narrow trail that disappeared into scrub brush. She lifted the buckets, felt their rough texture against her soft palms, and began the descent. The weight became unbearable within minutes. Her muscles screamed in protest. Sweat soaked through her already ruined dress. She stumbled, nearly dropping the precious containers, and heard a quickly stifled laugh from somewhere behind her. Emmett, watching from a distance, had made this journey 1,000 times without complaint. But something her father had once told her surfaced through the fog of exhaustion. Thomas had spoken about packers on the mountain trails, how they carried heavy loads by finding a rhythm, by making the weight part of their movement rather than fighting against it. Clara adjusted her grip, found the balance point of the buckets, began to walk with shorter, more deliberate steps. The laughter stopped. By the time she reached the spring, her hands were raw, and her back felt like it was on fire, but she had not dropped the buckets. The spring itself was a miracle of the high desert, clear water bubbling from between ancient rocks surrounded by ferns that seemed impossibly green against the dusty landscape. As Clara knelt to fill the vessels, she noticed something that made her pause. Scratches in the smooth stone beside the water. Marks that were too regular to be natural. They looked almost like the tally marks her father had used in his ledgers. a counting system, some kind of inventory tracker carved into living rock beside a mountain spring. She filed this observation away, sensing without understanding that knowledge of this place held significance beyond simple water collection. Someone had been counting something here, tracking resources, maintaining order in the wilderness. And whoever had done it used a system that bore an uncanny resemblance to the one Thomas Whitfield had taught his daughter. The journey back up the slope was agony. The filled buckets weighed more than Clara would have believed possible, and her legs trembled with each step. But she forced herself to continue, hearing her father's voice, speaking of frontier survival, of how weakness was the one luxury no one in the territory could afford. When she finally reached the homestead, her dress soaked with sweat and splashed spring water, Opal took the buckets and examined them critically. The old woman's expression revealed nothing, but she did not send Clara back for more. In the economy of this harsh world, that counted as a small victory. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of labor that seemed designed to break her spirit. She scraped hides until her fingers bled, the smell of tanning chemicals and dried meat becoming as familiar as her own breath. She ground corn into meal using stones that seemed determined to crush her hands along with the grain. She learned to bank fires, to identify which plants held water in their roots, to move through the homestead without disturbing hierarchies she was only beginning to understand. During that first week, the two younger Stone brothers formed opposite poles of Clara's experience. Josiah was a wall of stone. He did not simply speak little. He seemed to regard Clara's existence as a security risk to be monitored, rather than a human being to be acknowledged. During meals, he sat across from her, but looked through her as if she were made of glass. When she worked in the yard, she felt his gaze from the edge of the forest, not hostile, but evaluating. The way a hunter studies unfamiliar tracks in familiar territory, determining whether they belong to prey or threat. One morning, Clara was stumbled while carrying water and spilled half a bucket. She looked up and found Josiah standing 10 paces away, his amber eyes recording her clumsiness with absolute calm, then turning away without a word. That silence hurt worse than any criticism could have. But there were subtle signs that Josiah was not entirely indifferent. On the third day, when Clara was struggling to split a stubborn log with an axe too heavy for her, she discovered that someone had scored a crack along the grain during the night, making it vastly easier to split. She never saw who did it, but the knife marks in the wood matched the big blade Josiah carried on his hip. That was his way of helping. Invisible, wordless, as if publicly acknowledging that she needed assistance would be an insult to them both. Emmett was the opposite. He was the only person in the household who voluntarily spoke to Clara. During that first week, though conversation by mountain man standards meant a handful of clipped sentences per day, Emmett was the one who showed her where the outhouse was without making her die of embarrassment. The one who explained in a voice that was almost apologetic that she would be sleeping on the floor near the fireplace because Grandma Opal says you have not earned a room yet, and Grandma Opal's word is God's word on this mountain, only meaner. There was a small moment on the second night that revealed more about Emmett than any speech could have. Clara sat huddled near the dying fire, hungry because she was not accustomed to mountain rations and too exhausted to eat. Emmett sat down beside her, a bowl of stew and a piece of cornbread. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply placed the food down and walked away with the gentleness that was almost startling from a man whose hands were twice the size of hers. Clara ate every bite and felt for the first time since leaving Silver Creek something close to gratitude. Through it all, Caleb watched from a distance, never interfering, but always present, a shadow at the edge of her vision. She felt his gaze during the moments when she wanted to collapse, when the work seemed impossible, and the urge to simply give up whispered seductively in her mind. Something about his silent observation, not judgment, but something closer to patient assessment, kept her moving when her body screamed for rest. He watched her the way a horseman watches a young colt clearing its first obstacle. Not helping, not hindering, just observing whether the animal has something inside worth investing time in. 1 week after Clara arrived, a group of mountain traders came to the homestead to exchange goods for the Stone brothers' tanned hides and fur pelts. Clara watched from the kitchen area as the negotiation began. The lead trader, a man named Crawley with tobacco-stained teeth and calculating eyes, was showing Opal a bolt of blue cloth, praising its quality as pure wool, while simultaneously arguing for a lower price on the hides she offered in exchange. Josiah and Emmett stood behind their grandmother, but it was clear they understood fur and traps and rifles, not the manufacturing techniques of Eastern textile mills. But Thomas Whitfield had taught his daughter to spot fraud in the textile trade. She had spent countless afternoons in his study examining fabric samples sent from Eastern suppliers, learning to recognize the difference between quality wool and cotton mixed with cheaper fibers. This blue cloth that Crawley was passing off as pure wool was clearly a blend, evident in the way it caught the light, evident in the slightly stiff drape of the material, evident in the texture when you pulled a single thread from the edge and rolled it between your fingers. Crawley was cheating Opal, expecting the old woman's ignorance of white manufacturing techniques to work in his favor. Before Clara could consider the wisdom of her actions, she rose and walked toward the trading circle. The conversation stopped abruptly. All eyes turned to her with expressions ranging from surprise to anger at the interruption. Clara pointed at the cloth, then at the pile of perfectly tanned hides, and shook her head firmly. She spoke in a voice that was clear and calm, pointing out the technical evidence of blending, the way light reflected differently off cotton mixed fibers, the abnormal stiffness when the fabric fell, the texture of a single thread pulled from the edge. She estimated the actual value at roughly a third of what Crawley was demanding. Therefore, if he wanted fair trade, he would double the hide count or there would be no deal at all. The silence that followed Clara's words was heavier than mountain stone. Crawley's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment at being exposed. But Opal's sharp obsidian eyes had already gone to the fabric, her weathered fingers testing it with knowledge born of years evaluating materials. The old woman's expression darkened as she confirmed what Clara had indicated. She thrust the cloth back at Crawley and demanded revised terms. Double the hides or he leaves with his packs heavier than when he arrived. Crawley, knowing that word of his dishonesty would spread quickly among the mountain families, had no choice but to accept. He left in bitter silence, considerably lighter in goods and heavier in humiliation. After the traders departed, Opal turned to Clara with an expression that was still severe, but held a flicker of something new, grudging respect. The old woman gestured for Clara to follow her back into the kitchen, where she offered a bowl of stew without the usual air of resentment, a small gesture. But in the economy of this harsh world, it spoke volumes about shifting status. More importantly, Caleb had stood silent throughout the entire event, watching everything. When Clara returned to the kitchen area, she caught his amber eyes, and for the first time she saw in them not cold assessment, but something closer to genuine attention. He looked at her the way a man looks at a tool he has just discovered has an unexpected and valuable use, not as an object, as a capability. Josiah watched too, said nothing. But that evening when Clara went to her sleeping mat near the fireplace, she found a pair of leather gloves perfectly sized for her small hands, well made, and recently stitched, placed beside her blanket. No one claimed them, but Clara knew who did the finest leather work in the household. The days after the trader incident marked a subtle but profound shift. Clara no longer slept on the floor. Emmett, without explanation or ceremony, cleared out a small room behind the kitchen and placed in it a simple wooden bed with a clean straw mattress and a fur blanket. It was not luxury, but it had a door. And having a door between herself and the rest of the house was a luxury Clara did not know she needed until she had it. The three brothers began including her in real work. Caleb taught her to identify animal tracks, to know when bears or mountain lions were ranging close enough to warrant caution. Josiah, still silent, let her watch while he set beaver traps, explaining through gesture, more than words, how to read water flow, choose locations, camouflage a trap with mud and leaf mold. She realized Josiah was a master of patience. He could sit motionless for hours waiting for the right animal to enter range. And that same patience was what he was applying to her. Watching, observing, withholding final judgment. Emmett taught her mountain cooking, dried venison, root stew, cornbread baked on hot coals. He discovered that Clara had an unexpected talent for tasting and adjusting wild herb seasonings. One evening, she experimented with a combination of forest herbs in the stew, and all three brothers ate second bowls without comment. But the empty bowls said more than any compliment. Clara applied the skills her father had taught her. She created an inventory tracking system for the first storage using marks similar to the ones she had seen carved beside the spring. When Caleb examined her system, his amber eyes lit with the careful attention of a man who recognized the value of any tool that brought order to chaos. He eventually integrated her method into the broader resource management of the homestead. That night from the porch, Clara overheard the three brothers talking quietly by the outdoor fire. She could not follow the entire conversation, but she recognized the rhythmic cadence of storytelling, and she heard her own name mentioned several times. The tone was not hostile, it was curious, questioning, as if the three of them were trying to understand exactly what had been deposited in the middle of their lives. What Clara could not know was that Opal, in the privacy of her own memory, was excavating a faded image from long ago. The winter of 1851, the worst winter in anyone's memory on Stone Mountain. The Stone family had lived on this ridge since before Caleb was born, homesteaders who had built their compound on the high ground to stay clear of the conflicts and the road agents that plagued the lower valleys. That terrible winter, a blizzard lasted 3 weeks and cut every supply line. The family was starving. The children were sick. Opal's own daughter-in-law had gone hollow-eyed and silent rationing the last handful of cornmeal between 3 small boys who did not understand why their stomachs hurt. And then she came, a young woman, blonde hair, blue eyes that held a light which refused to go out even in the face of a mountain that was trying to kill everyone on it. She came from the Whitfield Ranch below, climbing 3 miles of ice-covered trail, 5 times in 3 weeks, carrying food and medicine and cloth on her back, heavily pregnant, defying her husband's warnings and her neighbors' contempt. The townspeople called the Stone family savages. This woman called them neighbors. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She saved them, every one of them. And when Eleanor died, giving birth to a daughter in the spring of 1852, the loss was mourned on both sides of the mountain. The resemblance between Eleanor and the girl who now stood in Opal's kitchen was subtle but persistent, visible in the shape of the eyes, in the set of the jaw, in that particular quality of light that refused to be extinguished no matter how dark the circumstances. Opal did not speak of this memory, not yet, but it lingered in her mind like smoke from a distant fire, connecting past to present in ways that only time could fully reveal. 2 years after Eleanor's visits, in the autumn of 1853, a band of thieves discovered that the Stone homestead was rich in fur and provisions. They attacked at night. Caleb's parents were killed. Opal was badly wounded but survived. Caleb, 14 years old, killed 2 of the attackers with his father's rifle and drove the rest away into the darkness. From that night forward, he became the head of the family, not by fleeing up the mountain, but by holding the ground his parents had built upon defending it with blood and absolute isolation. He closed every door to the world below, the world that had sent the men who killed his parents. And now, 20 years later, the world below had sent something else entirely. A girl in a navy blue dress who could read a false bolt of cloth at 30 paces and who carried in her spine a stubbornness that Caleb recognized because he had been born with the same one. On an evening when the sunset was painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and honey, Clara stepped out onto the porch to breathe the cold night air. She saw Willa Brennan climbing the trail toward the homestead, carrying her 6-year-old son Tobias asleep on her shoulder. Willa was a young widow, 28, whose husband had died in a mining accident 2 years earlier. She lived in a small cabin on the south slope, surviving under the protection of the Stone brothers, who ensured her safety, brought her game, and repaired what broke. Not charity. The mountain's web of mutual dependence that kept everyone alive through the winters. Willa was coming to ask the brothers for help repairing storm damage to her roof. She ducked through the porch doorway, shifting the sleeping boy on her shoulder, and as she bent to set Tobias down on the porch bench, her coat fell open. In the firelight streaming from the kitchen window, Clara saw it, a silver locket, small, southwestern in style, bearing a delicate engraving of a wild columbine flower, the blossom that grew nowhere else but in the high meadows of the Colorado mountains. Clara's heart stopped for one full beat. She had seen that exact locket before, in a portrait of her mother that her father had kept in his study. Eleanor Rose Whitfield, young and luminous, wearing a silver locket around her neck, a unique piece commissioned by Clara's grandfather from a renowned silversmith in Santa Fe, one of only 3 ever made. That locket should not be here, around the neck of a widow living on a mountainside where Clara had been sent to disappear. Unless her mother had been here first, unless Eleanor Whitfield, the woman Clara barely remembered, had connections to this place and these people that ran deeper than anyone had ever told her. Unless the stories Thomas had shared about her mother's independent spirit, her unexplained absences from the ranch, her fascination with the mountain communities were not quirks of character but evidence of a relationship that had been deliberately hidden. Unless Clara had not been sent to a random mountain at all, unless she had been delivered through the cruelest of coincidences to the exact place where her mother's heart had found its truest home. The implications washed over Clara like cold water from the spring. She stood on the porch of a house built by people her mother had saved, wearing a dress that hid the will that would save herself, looking at a locket that connected two generations of Whitfield women to this impossible place on the roof of the world. A circle was closing. One that neither side had planned, one that Vivian Caldwell, in all her calculating brilliance, could never have imagined. And somewhere far below in the comfortable rooms of the Whitfield ranch that she had stolen, Vivian was sleeping soundly, believing her stepdaughter's story was finished. It was only beginning. Clara did not ask about the locket. She wanted to. The question burned in her chest like a coal she had swallowed hot and insistent, demanding to be released into the open air, where it could either illuminate or destroy. But she had learned something in her weeks on Stone Mountain that the girl who arrived in the dusty navy dress could never have understood. She had learned the art of waiting. On the frontier, timing was everything. A trap set one day too early caught nothing. A shot fired one heartbeat too soon missed the mark. And a question asked before the ground was prepared could be as dangerous as a rattlesnake stepped on in the dark. You did not rush toward truth on this mountain. You circled it. You studied it from a distance. You let it reveal itself in its own time, because forcing a revelation before the moment was ripe could shatter the very thing you were trying to understand. So Clara watched Willa Brennan instead. She watched the young widow come and go from the homestead, carrying Tobias on her hip, or leading the boy by the hand up the mountain trail. Willa was 28 with the lean strength of a woman who had been doing the work of two people since her husband's mining accident. Her face was windburned and her hands were calloused, but there was a gentleness in the way she moved around her son that reminded Clara of descriptions her father had given of Eleanor, her mother, the woman she barely remembered. Clara noticed how Willa wore the locket. Not as ordinary jewelry, she wore it the way a soldier wears a medal, close to the skin, hidden beneath her clothing when strangers were near. Her hand would drift to it unconsciously when she was anxious or sad, her fingers finding the shape of it through the fabric the way a person touches a wound to remind themselves they survived it. The locket held significance for Willa that went beyond decoration. It was an inheritance, an emotional heirloom passed down through connection rather than blood. Clara watched and waited and continued to work. The relationship between Clara and Caleb grew through the language of shared labor, which was the only language either of them was fluent in when it came to matters that lived beneath the surface of ordinary speech. Caleb taught her to identify plants that held medicinal properties. He would crouch beside a cluster of growth that Clara's untrained eye would have dismissed as weeds, and he would crush a leaf between his massive fingers, releasing scents that made her grandmother's herb garden seem tame by comparison. Sharp, mineral, ancient. He showed her how yarrow root could stop bleeding when pressed into a wound, how the inner bark of willow stripped and boiled could reduce fever and ease pain, how to tell poison oak from harmless vine by the shape of the leaf cluster and the slightly oily sheen on the surface that caught the light wrong if you knew what you were looking for. Clara in turn showed him the inventory system she had built for the fur storage. She explained the logic behind the columns and the tallies the way numbers could tell a story about what was owed and what was owned, about seasonal patterns and fair trade values. Her father's voice echoed through every explanation. Thomas Whitfield had believed that numbers were the most honest language ever invented because numbers could not lie unless a liar deliberately rearranged them. And Clara had inherited his faith in systems, in order, in the quiet power of keeping accurate records in a world that preferred chaos. Caleb studied her system with the careful attention of a man who recognized value in any tool that brought structure to wilderness. He asked no questions. He simply looked absorbed and eventually integrated her method into the broader resource management of the homestead. That silent adoption was his version of applause. Their connection deepened through the ritual of working side by side. There was one particular afternoon that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Caleb was teaching her to weave a windbreak fence from willow branches, a technique that created a structure flexible enough to bend with the mountain gales rather than shatter against them. His hands guided hers through the motion. The physical proximity was innocent in purpose, but intimate in execution, and Clara became acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his skin despite the evening chill, the scent of sage smoke and mountain air that clung to his clothing. The way his fingers scarred and enormous moved with a precision that seemed impossible for hands that size. Her heart beat faster, not with the fear she had felt during their first meeting, but with something newer and more frightening. The recognition that she was beginning to feel safe near this man, that the calloused hands guiding hers through the willow branches carried a patience and a protectiveness she had believed she lost forever when her father died. Caleb did not pull away, but he did not look at her either. His amber eyes stayed fixed on the willow, his jaw tight with the iron self-control that Clara was beginning to understand was his defining characteristic. Caleb Stone was not a man without feeling. He was a man who controlled his feelings with the discipline of a soldier, because on this mountaintop where he bore responsibility for every life under his protection, losing control could mean losing everything. One evening beside the creek that fed the homestead's water supply, they found themselves working in parallel silence. Clara was washing clay from a batch of newly dug pottery vessels. Caleb had arrived upstream with a brace of rabbits kneeling at the water's edge to clean them with the efficient movements of a man who had performed this task 10,000 times. For long minutes, the only sounds were the rush of water over stone and the distant call of a hawk riding thermal currents above the ridge. Then Caleb began to speak. His words came slowly, carefully, like a man opening a door he had kept locked for 20 years, unsure whether the room behind it still existed or had crumbled to dust in his absence. He told her about the night the thieves came, autumn of 1853. He was 14. His parents had built this homestead from nothing, had carved a life from the granite and the pine, and they had been happy in the way that mountain people are happy. Not with luxury, but with sufficiency, with the knowledge that what they had earned. The thieves came because the stone homestead was known to be rich in furs and provisions. They came at night. They killed his father first, then his mother when she tried to reach the rifle. Caleb heard the shots from the loft where he slept with his brothers. Josiah was 10, Emmett was 6, Opal was in the back room and the thieves found her there. She fought. They left her for dead with a wound across her ribs that should have killed her but did not, because Opal Stone had apparently decided that dying was not on her schedule. Caleb came down the ladder with his father's Springfield rifle and the cold clarity that sometimes descends upon children when the adult world shatters around them. He killed 2 of the attackers. The rest fled into the darkness, leaving behind 2 dead parents and 3 orphaned boys and a grandmother bleeding on the floor. From that night forward, Caleb became the head of the family. He did not flee to the mountain. He was already on it. He simply closed every door to the world below, the world that had sent the men who murdered his parents. He raised his brothers. He maintained the homestead. He became father and mother and commander all at once, sacrificing his own youth on the altar of responsibility with a completeness that still showed in the early lines around his eyes, and the way he sometimes stood at the cliff edge and stared down at the valley with the expression of a man who had given everything and was not entirely certain the price had been worth paying. Clara listened with her hands still in the cold water, understanding that this was not casual conversation, but something more significant, a sharing of story as foundation for deeper trust. When he finished, she found herself reciprocating without conscious decision. She told him about her father's death, about the suffocating cage Vivian had constructed, about the moment on the wagon when she understood that her own people had discarded her as completely as one might abandon a broken tool. She spoke of her mother, Eleanor, the woman she barely remembered, the persistent sense that there were truths about her family's past that had been deliberately hidden. As she spoke, Caleb's hands never stopped their efficient work cleaning the rabbits, but she felt the quality of his attention shift. He absorbed not just her words, but the emotions beneath them. When she mentioned her mother's connection to the mountains, he paused for just a heartbeat. His knife glinted in the fading light before resuming its task. The pause was brief enough to be coincidental, but Clara had learned to read the small signals of this world, and she knew she had touched on something significant. That night, when she returned to her small room behind the kitchen, Clara lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling beams and thinking about the way Caleb's voice had sounded when he spoke of his parents. Raw, unprotected, like a man showing a wound he usually kept bandaged. He had trusted her with his most painful truth, and she understood that in his language, this was more intimate than any embrace. The crisis came with the brutal suddenness of a summer storm breaking over the mountains. Little Tobias Brennan had been playing near the canyon edge where the mountainside dropped away in a series of sandstone shelves. The boy was 6 years old with curly brown hair and eyes too large for his face that always seemed surprised by the world around him. He was fearless in the way that only children can be fearless, which is to say, he was entirely ignorant of the physics of gravity and the fragility of ancient rock. The earth beneath his feet gave way. Sandstone that had held firm for 1,000 years chose that particular moment to crumble like a broken promise. His fall was not far, perhaps 15 feet, but the angle was wrong and he struck an outcropping of rock with a sickening force that echoed off the canyon walls like a gunshot. His screams brought the entire homestead running. Caleb arrived first, covering ground with strides that ate distance like a wolf in pursuit. Josiah appeared from the tree line where he had been checking snares. Emmett came from the stable at a dead sprint. Willa, who had been visiting the homestead to collect mended clothing, heard her son's voice and made a sound that Clara would never forget. A sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a word. Something older than language. The raw vocal expression of a mother whose child is in mortal danger. When they reached Tobias, the screams had faded to whimpers that were somehow more terrifying than the initial cries. The boy's leg was bent at an angle that made even the Stone brothers look away, despite everything they had seen in their lives on this mountain. Bone pressed against skin from within like something trying to escape from a cage of flesh. Willa was hysterical with grief and terror, clutching at her son, while others tried to assess the damage. Opal examined the boy with grave eyes, her weathered hands probing with the gentleness that only very old and very experienced women possess. She prepared what remedies she knew, but even Clara could see the doubt in the old woman's face. Opal had treated wounds and fevers, snake bites, and infections across 7 decades of mountain life. But this kind of injury, a compound fracture that threatened to pierce the skin, was beyond anything she had encountered. Time became elastic. It stretched into an agony of waiting as Opal worked. But as the hours passed, Tobias's whimpers grew fainter. His skin took on a grayish pallor that spoke of shock settling into his small body. His leg was swelling grotesquely, the flesh darkening like storm clouds, and Clara knew with horrible certainty that infection would follow if nothing changed. A memory surfaced from Clara's childhood with the clarity of spring water. Not a vague recollection, but a precise image, sharp-edged and detailed. She saw the pages of her grandfather's medical journal, Dr. James Whitfield's careful handwriting, the anatomical drawings, the step-by-step instructions for treating compound fractures in field conditions when no proper surgeon was available. She had read those passages a dozen times, tracing the diagrams with her finger, memorizing the sequence without understanding that she was preparing for this exact moment. She had never performed such a procedure, had never even witnessed one. But the child was dying before her eyes, and the alternative to acting was watching Tobias slip away while his mother's grief tore through the mountain air like something with claws. Clara pushed through the gathered people, her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. She knelt beside the injured boy and looked up. At Opal, at Caleb, who had appeared at the edge of the crowd with his rifle in hand and his face set like carved granite. At Willa, whose expression was a mask of desperate hope. Clara made a series of gestures that communicated both confidence and need. She could help, but she required specific items. The skepticism was immediate. Opal bristled at the implied insult to her abilities. She had kept this family alive for decades, and now this soft girl from the lowlands was suggesting she could do what Opal could not. But Opal was no fool. She remembered the incident with the traders. She remembered the precise knowledge that had exposed Crawley's fraud. She looked at Clara, at the steady certainty in those cornflower blue eyes, and made a calculation that overrode her pride. She gave a sharp nod. Caleb's dark amber eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that felt like sunlight through a magnifying glass, burning away pretense, seeing through every layer of politeness and performance to the raw material beneath. He was asking without words whether she truly had what this moment required. Whether the spark he had sensed in her was real or merely a desperate defiance that would crumble when confronted with blood and bone in a child's screams. Then he nodded. Once. A gesture that held the weight of granted authority. He gestured for others to bring what she requested. Clara demanded clean water boiled until it steamed, strips of leather that could be softened and shaped, straight branches from the willow thicket, and the strongest whiskey from the trade goods stored in the main house. As these items were gathered, she forced herself to recall every detail from her grandfather's journal. She visualized the diagrams of proper bone alignment, the descriptions of how to feel for correct placement despite swelling and pain, the warnings about shock and infection, and the critical importance of keeping everything clean. Her hands were shaking, but she could not afford to let fear control them now. A child's life depended on the steadiness of fingers that had never held anything more dangerous than an embroidery needle. The procedure that followed would haunt her dreams for years. She cleaned her hands in the boiling water, ignoring the way her skin turned red from the heat. She poured whiskey over the boy's leg while Caleb and Emmett held him still. Tobias's screams resumed with renewed vigor, but infection was the greater danger now. With fingers that felt clumsy and inadequate, she probed the swollen tissue, feeling for the displaced bone beneath. The sensation made her stomach heave. She swallowed the bile and continued whispering prayers she had learned in childhood and apologies she hoped the child's spirit could understand. The moment of realignment required more strength than she knew she possessed. She had to pull against contracted muscles and shift the bone back into its proper position, while Tobias's screams reached a pitch that seemed to crack the sky itself. Caleb held the boy's upper body immobile with his massive hands, his face white beneath the tan, his jaw locked so tight the muscles stood out like cables. Emmett gripped the boy's other leg with hands that did not waver, though his jaw was clenched so tight that a vein stood out on his temple and his amber eyes had gone bright with something he would never admit to after the crisis had passed. And then she felt it, the subtle shift, bone sliding back into alignment, the unnatural angle straightening into something closer to what God had originally intended. She splinted the leg with the willow branches, binding them tightly with softened leather strips, creating an immobilization that would allow the bone to knit together if infection could be prevented. When it was finished, Clara sat back on her heels, her entire body shaking with released tension, her hands covered in blood and sweat. Tobias had mercifully passed into unconsciousness. His breathing was shallow but steady. Willow was sobbing, but these were different tears. Tears that carried a thread of hope rather than the pure black fabric of despair. In the chaos of working on the boy's leg, Clara had noticed something that her conscious mind registered without fully processing. Willa, in her frantic movements, had caused the small leather pouch around her neck to fall open. And inside, visible for just a moment in the fading light, was the silver locket. The columbine flower engraving caught the firelight and flashed. Now in the aftermath, as the crowd dispersed and the boy rested, Clara looked at the locket with new eyes. The southwestern-style silverwork, the wild columbine, the craftsmanship that matched detail for detail, the locket in her mother's portrait, a piece commissioned by her grandfather from a silversmith in Santa Fe, one of only 3 ever made. The implications washed over her like snowmelt. Her mother had known these people, had been close enough to them to gift a personal treasure of profound sentimental value. The stories her father had told of Eleanor's independent spirit, her unexplained absences from the ranch, her fascination with the mountain communities above the valley, those fragments suddenly assembled into a picture that was larger and more meaningful than Clara had imagined. Eleanor Whitfield had not merely observed these people from a safe distance below. She had been part of their lives. She had climbed this mountain. She had entered this homestead. She had formed bonds strong enough to warrant the giving of heirlooms. And now, 2 decades later, her daughter had been delivered back to the same place through the cruelest of coincidences. A circle closing that neither party had planned. The reactions of the 3 Stone brothers in the hours after Clara saved Tobias told her more about each of them than all the previous weeks combined. Caleb came to her as she stood alone by the woodpile, still trembling from the adrenaline and the horror and the strange wild pride of having done something she did not know she could do. He did not speak. His hand touched her shoulder. Just one moment of contact so subtle that others might have missed it entirely. But Clara felt it like a benediction. In his amber eyes, she saw something that had not been there before. Recognition between equals. The look one survivor gives another when they witness true courage. He had been testing her, she realized. not with cruelty, but with observation, waiting to see whether the spark he had sensed at that first meeting was genuine or merely the shallow defiance of a woman who would crumble under real hardship. Now he knew. Josiah's response was silent but unmistakable. That evening, he sat beside the outdoor fire and worked on something. For a long time, his lean body hunched over his hands, the firelight playing across his scarred knuckles. The next morning, Clara found a hunting knife beside her bed. Small, perfectly balanced, the edge honed to a sharpness that could split a hair. The handle was wrapped in leather that fit her hand as if it had been measured. No one claimed credit, but Clara knew who did the finest blade work on Stone Mountain. In Josiah's language, this was a declaration. He had accepted her enough to give her a weapon, and in the philosophy of mountain men, giving someone a blade meant you trusted them not to use it against your family. Emmett's reaction was the most human of the three. After the crowd had dispersed and Willa had carried Tobias inside, Clara went to the creek to wash the blood from her hands. The water was cold enough to numb her fingers, and she scrubbed until her skin was raw, trying to clean away not just the blood, but the memory of how it had felt to probe a child's broken bone through swollen flesh. She was still shaking. Not from cold. Emmett appeared. He did not speak. He simply sat down beside her on the creek bank, his shoulder touching hers, his large frame a solid and grounding presence. He stayed there for a long time, saying nothing, offering nothing except the physical fact of his proximity. In his silence, Clara heard the words he could not say. "You are not alone. What you did was extraordinary. I am here." They sat together until the stars came out. Opal chose her moment with the precision of a woman who had navigated family politics for 7 decades. One morning when the household was occupied with the daily rhythms of mountain life, the old woman approached Clara with the silver locket resting in her wrinkled palm. She had taken it from Willa's belongings, not theft, but investigation. The kind of examination that grandmothers conduct when they sense that the world is arranging itself according to patterns too important to ignore. She held the locket between them like a bridge across decades of silence. Opal spoke slowly, her gravel voice pulling up memories from deep storage, from places in her mind where the past was preserved not in words, but in the texture of emotion. The locket, she said, was a gift, given by a young woman named Eleanor to the grandmother of Willa Brennan. Given during the winter of 1851, when the Stone family came closer to dying than at any other point in their long history on the mountain. That winter, Opal said the blizzard lasted 3 weeks. It sealed the mountain like a tomb. The supply trails vanished under 6 feet of snow. The food ran out on the 9th day. By the 14th day, Opal's daughter-in-law, Caleb's mother, had gone hollow-eyed and silent, dividing the last handful of cornmeal between 3 small boys who cried from hunger in their sleep. And then Eleanor came, a young woman from the ranch below. Blonde hair, blue eyes that held a light which refused to be extinguished. She was pregnant heavily, so her body swollen with the child who would become Clara. And she climbed 3 miles of ice-covered tray carrying food and medicine and cloth on her back 5 times in 3 weeks. She came in defiance of her husband's warnings, in defiance of her neighbor's contempt. The people of Silver Creek called the Stone family savages. Eleanor Whitfield called them human beings. She saved them, every one of them, and she left her mark on the mountain in ways that went beyond memory. The tally marks carved beside the spring, the counting system that Clara had noticed on her first day, those were Eleanor's work. She had taught Opal's daughter-in-law how to track water levels and seasonal flow using the same system her husband Thomas used in his ranch ledgers. A practical gift from a practical woman carved into stone so it would outlast the flesh that made it. Opal's voice cracked on that last revelation, and Clara saw something she had never expected to see. Moisture in those obsidian eyes. The old woman who had survived thieves and blizzards and the death of her own children, who had raised 3 orphaned grandsons on a mountaintop with nothing but stubbornness and stone, hard will, was weeping, silently, without apology, because some debts could never be fully repaid, and the memory of the woman who had carried life up a frozen mountain while carrying life inside her own body was one of those debts. When Eleanor died, giving birth to Clara in the spring of 1852, Opal said the loss was mourned on the mountain as deeply as it was mourned in the valley below. The locket was kept as a sacred object, passed down through the women of the mountain community as a reminder that understanding between their worlds was possible. Rare and precious as spring water in drought, but possible. Clara stood motionless, the locket resting in Opal's palm between them, and felt the full weight of revelation settle over her like a mantle. Her mother had not merely known these people. She had been woven into their history. She had left a legacy of compassion that rippled forward through 2 decades of silence. The connection between Clara and this place was not the random cruelty of her stepmother's betrayal. It was something deeper, a calling home, to a people her mother had loved enough to risk her life for. The universe, in its mysterious and often brutal way, had returned Clara to the exact place where her mother's spirit had found its truest kinship, closing a circle that began before Clara was even born. That night, Clara sat on the flat rock overlooking the valley and tried to absorb what she had learned. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful in their constancy. She thought about Eleanor, the mother she barely remembered, a woman who had looked at a family the world called savage and seen only people who needed help, who had carried food up a frozen mountain while carrying a baby inside her body, who had died bringing that baby into the world, never knowing that 21 years later, her daughter would be delivered to the same mountainside by cruelty rather than compassion, and would find there the same thing Eleanor had found, a home. The peace of the high mountains, fragile as spider silk, began to show its first tears on an afternoon when the wind blew wrong. It came from the southwest instead of its usual eastern flow, carrying scents that made the horses nervous and sent the dogs pacing with hackles raised. Josiah was the first to notice. He stood at the eastern lookout, his lean body a statue of focused attention, reading signals in the landscape that Clara was only beginning to understand. The absence of bird calls, the way dust rose in unnatural patterns along the distant trail, the quality of silence that preceded violence. Josiah's skills as a tracker had kept the homestead alive for 20 years. He could follow 3-day-old deer tracks across bare rock. He could read weather from the movement of clouds across the peaks. He could hear the difference between ordinary wind and wind carrying the smell of danger. He was the early warning system. The reason the Stone family still existed when so many other mountain homesteads had been abandoned or destroyed. He dispatched himself and 2 men from neighboring cabins as scouts moving down the mountain with the silent efficiency of shadows flowing across stone. Clara watched from the porch, her hands frozen over the basket she had been weaving, as the entire homestead shifted into a state of alert preparation. Children from neighboring families were moved to safe positions. Weapons were checked. Emergency supplies were gathered. The practiced ease of these movements spoke of a community that lived always one step ahead of annihilation. Opal appeared at Clara's side and pressed a small knife into her hand. Not a warrior's blade, but the kind used for cutting leather, its edge worn, but still serviceable. The old woman's eyes held no room for argument as she pointed toward the shallow cave system at the mountain's base where the most vulnerable would shelter. Clara understood the implication. If whatever was approaching breached the homestead's defenses, the knife was not for fighting. Josiah returned before sunset. His report was delivered in clipped sentences, but the information drained color from faces that had weathered every hardship the mountain could produce. A group of men, perhaps a dozen strong, was ascending the mountain trails with purpose that suggested specific knowledge, rather than random exploration. These were not regular army patrols. These men moved like bounty hunters, like trackers paid to find specific quarry. And they followed a path that should have been known only to those who had lived on these heights for years. Willa Brennan, frightened but brave, approached Clara in the shelter cave. Tobias slept peacefully against his mother's shoulder, despite the tension crackling through the air. Willa explained what the scouts had learned. The men were led by Dalton Crane, a professional tracker with a reputation for finding anything that anyone wanted to stay lost. He had been asking questions in Silver Creek, spreading silver among the town's more flexible citizens, inquiring about the mountain people, and specifically about any white woman who might have been taken in by the savages on Stone Mountain. But the danger was compounded by something worse. Dalton had brought with him a man who claimed to be a federal marshal, Wade Hicks, though the legitimacy of his badge was questionable given how far he was operating beyond any reasonable jurisdiction. This marshal carried papers, writs that authorized the recovery of a stolen white woman being held against her will by lawless men on the mountain. The legal fiction was perfect in its cynicism. With those papers, the Stone brothers became criminals, kidnappers. Any resistance from them would serve as evidence of their savage nature. Any violence would justify a larger force returning to clean out the mountain once and for all. Vivian Caldwell had turned the legal system into a weapon. If Clara went willingly, Vivian won. If the Stone brothers resisted, they became outlaws, and Vivian still won. The confrontation took place on a flat stretch of ground between the homestead and the approaching trail. Neutral territory. Caleb stood at the center with Josiah and Emmett flanking him. Clara stood at his side, not hidden like stolen property, but presented as a person with agency in her own fate. Dalton Crane dismounted with the swagger of a man who believed the law, however corrupted, gave him unassailable authority. Marshal Hicks stood beside him, his nasal voice reciting official language about jurisdictional authority and the recovery of abducted persons. Then something happened that neither Dalton nor his fraudulent marshal had anticipated. Clara stepped forward. Her movements were deliberate and calm, and she spoke not in the broken voice of someone traumatized and desperate, but in clear measured English that carried across the space between them with perfect clarity. My name is Clara Rose Whitfield. I am the sole daughter and legal heir of Thomas Whitfield of Silver Creek. I was not kidnapped. I was sold by my stepmother to men who intended my death. I was saved by these men who now give me shelter of my own free will. The words hung in the mountain air like gunsmoke. Clara saw the flicker of panic cross Dalton's face before he could mask it. They had come expecting a traumatized victim, grateful for rescue. A woman whose testimony could be easily dismissed. Instead, they faced a composed witness whose words, if allowed to reach proper authorities, could unravel every thread of Vivian's carefully constructed fiction. Dalton recovered quickly. His voice took on a tone of patronizing concern. Miss Whitfield was clearly not in her right mind. Her time in captivity had disordered her thoughts. Her stepmother was frantic with worry. But even as he spoke, Clara saw calculation in his eyes, the wheels turning as he considered whether it might be simpler to kill everyone present and claim the mountain savages had murdered the hostage rather than surrender her. Caleb, reading the same dangerous shift in the air, made a subtle gesture. Josiah appeared on the rocks above rifle, clearly visible, the barrel trained on the parley ground, with the steady patience of a man who could hold a sight picture for hours without his hands trembling. Emmett materialized on the opposite flank, creating a crossfire that would turn any aggressive advance into a killing field. The message was unmistakable. Any violence would be mutual, and while Dalton's party might ultimately prevail through numbers, enough of them would die in the process to make the profit margin of this venture deeply unappealing. The standoff stretched into minutes that felt like hours, each side assessing angles and outcomes, weighing the cost of action against the uncertainty of retreat. It was Marshal Hicks who blinked first. His bureaucrat's instinct for self-preservation overrode whatever pay he had been promised. He announced that the situation was more complex than initially presented, that further investigation would be required, that for now his authority did not extend to forcibly removing someone who claimed to be staying of their own free will. Dalton's rage was barely contained as he remounted his horse. His eyes promised future violence, even as he turned back down the trail. But he had been thwarted, at least temporarily, by the one thing he and Vivian had never anticipated. That Clara Whitfield, the meek girl who had been so easily controlled and discarded, had found in the mountains not just refuge, but the steel-hard core of someone who understood what she was truly worth. The men retreated in bitter silence. Their footprints were already being erased by the wind. But Clara knew and Caleb knew, and Josiah knew with the certainty of a tracker who has seen a predator retreat only to circle back from a different angle, that this was only a reprieve, not a victory. The attack came 3 days later. Dalton waited just long enough for the hypervigilance to soften into the routine of daily survival. Then in the hours before dawn, when sleep is deepest and the watch most likely to nod, he sent his men up the mountain carrying torches and kerosene-soaked rags, intending to burn the homestead the way a man smokes out a den of troublesome animals. The first structure to catch was the storage shed on the eastern edge closest to the approach trail. The flames spread with horrifying speed. Dry pine timbers and grass became a roaring inferno that sent sparks spiraling into the pre-dawn darkness like malevolent stars falling upward. The screams came immediately, not just fear but rage. The sound of people who had survived too much to be exterminated in their sleep by men too cowardly to face them in daylight. The three Stone brothers responded with the muscle memory of men who had drilled for exactly this nightmare. Caleb held the center, his old Springfield rifle speaking in sharp, measured reports that echoed off the canyon walls. Each shot was deliberate, aimed, the shooting of a man who could not afford to waste ammunition. Josiah took the high ground to the north, and his shooting was different from Caleb's. Fewer rounds. But everyone found its mark delivered with the cold precision of a hunter who had spent 20 years learning that the difference between eating and starving was the ability to kill cleanly at distance. Emmett held the southern flank with a ferocity that surprised even his brothers. He fired faster, compensating for accuracy with volume covering the gap in their defensive line with raw aggression. Two of Dalton's hired guns fell before they realized their advantage had evaporated. Clara moved through the chaos with a strange clarity, her body operating on instinct, while her mind cataloged threats and resources with the cold precision her father had taught her. She saw Willa carrying Tobias toward the cave system, saw Opal directing a water brigade from the creek fighting the fire, not because it could be saved, but because the appearance of fighting bought time for evacuation. The old woman's obsidian eyes met Clara's across the burning yard, and in that glance was a transmission of knowledge. This was not about saving structures. This was about maintaining the appearance of resistance while getting the vulnerable to safety. Through the smoke, Clara saw Dalton directing his remaining men from a position of relative safety. He was screaming orders, his voice carrying notes of desperation as he realized his surprise attack had failed to produce the quick massacre he had promised his employer. She saw him pull one man aside, saw something pass between them. A smaller container, not kerosene, something that glinted metallic in the firelight. Dynamite, mining explosives, meant to collapse the cave system if the fire did not force everyone into the open for slaughter. The realization struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. The cave where the children sheltered, where Willa was huddled with Tobias and a dozen other vulnerable souls, would become a tomb if that charge was properly placed. The entrance was narrow. The walls were ancient sandstone that would collapse like crumbling bread if the explosive hit the right structural point. She moved without conscious thought, abandoning her position at the waterline and sprinting toward the cave entrance despite the shouts of alarm from those who saw her break from cover. The man carrying the dynamite was young, barely 20, with the nervous energy of someone who had signed on for easy money and was now in waters far too dangerous to navigate. He approached the cave entrance from above using the rocks as cover, clearly intending to drop the charge and retreat before detonation. But Clara had spent weeks learning these trails. She knew a shortcut through the boulders that the stranger did not. She emerged ahead of him, placing herself between him and his target, her leather knife in one hand, a stone the size of a child's head in the other. They faced each other in a frozen moment of mutual recognition. He saw a white woman, her face streaked with soot and sweat, standing in defense of children. She saw a boy who had made terrible choices and was now confronting the moment when those choices would define who he truly was. The decision was taken from both of them by a rifle shot from an unexpected direction. Not from the homestead defenders, from higher up the mountain, from a position that should have been empty. Josiah, he had repositioned during the battle, reading the fight, the way he read the forest, seeing the pattern before it completed. He had recognized the dynamite threat before anyone else had moved with the silent speed of a hunting cat across terrain he knew in his bones, and had placed himself where he could end the threat with a single shot. The young man dropped. The dynamite bundle fell from nerveless fingers. Clara lunged forward and caught it before it struck stone. Her hands closed around the wrapped cylinders. Solid. Terrifying. The fuse already lit and sparking its inexorable countdown. She ran, not toward the homestead where fire still raged, not toward the cave where precious lives sheltered, but perpendicular to both, sprinting along the narrow trail that led to the sheer drop overlooking the valley below. Her lungs burned. Her vision narrowed to tunnel focus. She counted heartbeats against the shortening fuse. At the canyon's edge, she released the bundle with a prayer to any power that might be listening. Watched it arc out into empty space and disappear into darkness below. The explosion came before she hit the ground. The concussion wave slammed into her back and drove her forward. Her hands and knees scraped against stone as she skidded to a halt, inches short of following the dynamite into the abyss. For several seconds, she heard nothing but ringing silence. Then gradually a sound returned. The crackle of flames. The shouts of men, footsteps approaching. Caleb appeared above her. His face was a mask of soot and blood from a gash across his cheek, but his amber eyes burned with an emotion she could not name. He pulled her to her feet. His hands ran over her arms and shoulders with rapid efficiency, checking for injuries. His grip found hers. solid, grounding, the hands of a man who was shaking, though he would deny it until his dying day. In the aftermath, Clara found Emmett sitting alone beside the smoking ruins of the storage shed. His eyes were fixed on something invisible in the middle distance. He was trembling, not from cold. During the battle, Emmett had shot one of the attackers, a young man, close to the age Emmett had been when the thieves killed his parents. The symmetry was crushing. A boy who had grown up orphaned by violence had now dealt violence to someone else's child. The circle that every victim of brutality fears. The question that haunts anyone who has ever been forced to fight. Clara sat down beside him. She said nothing for a long time, just sat, present, patient, the way Emmett himself had sat beside her at the creek after she saved Tobias. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Emmett spoke. My parents were killed by thieves. I just killed someone's son. Am I the same as them? Clara answered quietly, but with certainty that came not from philosophy, but from the bedrock of moral clarity her father had built in her. Those thieves killed to take. You shot to keep. Those are two different worlds. Emmett did not respond, but his shoulders stopped shaking. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the smoke in shades of pink and gold. Dalton's remaining men began their retreat, dragging their wounded, leaving two dead where they had fallen. The homestead had suffered. One structure was destroyed. One neighbor was badly wounded. But they had held. They had survived. And Josiah the scout, whose rifle shot had saved Clara's life, brought intelligence that changed everything. He had been tracking Dalton's movements for days and had overheard conversations that revealed the full scope of Vivian Caldwell's plan. It was not merely about eliminating Clara. It was about using her death to legitimize a land claim that Vivian had been constructing through forged documents and corrupted officials. If Clara died in an attack by mountain savages, the territorial government would grant Vivian emergency powers to annex additional lands bordering the ranch. Lands that contained newly discovered copper deposits worth more than a decade of cattle sales combined. Clara's murder was just business, calculated with the cold efficiency of a banker foreclosing it on a failing loan. The knowledge settled into Clara's bones with the weight of absolute certainty. There would be no peace, no compromise, no chance of simply hiding on the mountain and hoping Vivian would eventually lose interest. Her stepmother had invested too much money and political capital, had exposed herself to too much potential legal liability if the truth ever surfaced. Clara's continued existence was not merely an obstacle. It was a mortal threat to everything Vivian had built. One of them would have to fall completely and permanently before this could end. Clara stood beside Caleb at the eastern lookout, watching the defeated men disappear down the mountain trail. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwined with a certainty that needed no words. She understood that she had crossed some final threshold in the night's violence. She was no longer a refugee these people sheltered out of honor to her mother's memory. She was family, someone who had thrown herself between danger and the community's most vulnerable members, who had earned her place through the most fundamental currency of frontier life, the willingness to die so others might live. But even in that moment of hard-won solidarity, she knew the battle was only half over. Dalton had been driven back, but Vivian remained secure in her stolen ranch below, protected by the fiction of legal ownership and the assumption that a woman of her social standing could not possibly be capable of calculated evil. To truly end this, to reclaim not just survival, but her birthright in her name, Clara would need to do something the frontier rarely saw. She would need to beat Vivian at her own game, using the laws and assumptions of the civilized world against themselves. She would need to leave the safety of this mountain and walk back into the viper's den, armed with nothing but truth and the terrifying presence of three brothers who now called her their own. She looked down at the valley below where Silver Creek lay hidden in the morning haze like a secret the land was keeping from the sky. Somewhere in that distant cluster of buildings, Vivian Caldwell was waking up in a stolen house, drinking coffee from a stolen cup, living a stolen life built on the assumption that the girl she had discarded would never come back to reclaim what was hers. That assumption was about to be tested, because Clara Whitfield had not survived fire and dynamite and the slow crucible of mountain winters to hide on a ridge for the rest of her life. She had survived them to become something Vivian had never planned for and could not have predicted. Not a victim, not a refugee, a reckoning. And reckonings, unlike victims, do not stay on the mountain. They come down. The night before Clara descended the mountain, she almost chose to stay. She sat alone on the flat rock that overlooked the valley, the same rock where she and Caleb had watched sunsets in silence, where she had begun to understand that belonging was not about walls and inheritance, but about the quality of attention others paid to your existence. Below her, the world spread out in darkness, vast and unknowable, punctuated only by the cold fire of stars reflected on distant water and the faint glow of Silver Creek's few lanterns burning like earthbound constellations 12 miles to the southwest. The temptation was enormous, larger than anything she had ever felt, larger than fear, larger than anger. It whispered to her in a voice that sounded reasonable and kind, the most dangerous combination in the world. Stay. Let Vivian have the ranch. Let her have the money and the land and the name Whitfield and everything that went with it. Clara would lose her inheritance. She would lose her legal identity. She would lose every connection to the civilized world below. But she would keep her life. She would keep this community that had become family. She would keep Caleb and Josiah and Emmett and Opal and Willa and little Tobias. She would keep the mountain and the creek and the stars and the scent of sage smoke at evening and the sound of wind through pine boughs that had become the acoustic signature of home. She could be happy here. She was already happier than she had been since her father died. Why risk everything for property and principle when she had already found the thing that property and principle were supposed to provide: safety, purpose, love, though the word had not yet been spoken between them. The temptation was so powerful that Clara's hands shook with it. She pressed them flat against the cold stone and felt the mountain's permanence beneath her palms, and wanted nothing more than to let that permanence swallow her, to become part of this place so completely that Vivian Caldwell would never find her, because she would have ceased to exist as a separate entity from the rock and the sky. But then she heard her father's voice. Thomas Whitfield, speaking from the grave with the calm authority he had carried in life, reminding her of what he had taught her about the difference between retreat and surrender. Retreat was strategy. Retreat preserved your forces for a future engagement on better ground. Surrender was the end. Surrender was what happened when you dressed defeat in the costume of wisdom and pretended you had chosen peace when what you had actually chosen was capitulation. If Clara stayed on the mountain and let Vivian keep the ranch, she was not choosing peace. She was choosing to let a murderer win. And the murderer would not stop. Vivian would use the ranch to fund the copper mining operation on the adjacent land. She would hire more men, expand her influence, build her empire on the foundation of Thomas Whitfield's stolen legacy. And Stone Mountain, the homestead that had become Clara's home, would forever exist in the shadow of a woman who had the resources and the ruthlessness and the motive to destroy it. The only way to make the homestead truly safe was to remove the threat at its source. And the only way to remove that threat was to descend into the valley with the truth in one hand and the law in the other, and force the world to see what Vivian Caldwell actually was. This was not about money. This was not about pride. This was about protecting every person Clara loved on this mountain from a predator who would never stop hunting as long as Clara's existence remained a loose thread in the fabric of her stolen life. Caleb found her on the rock just before dawn. He did not ask what she was thinking. He had lived with her long enough to read the answer in the curve of her shoulders, in the way her eyes traced the valley below, in the set of her jaw that he recognized because he had been born with the same one. He sat beside her, said nothing, offered nothing except the warmth of his presence and the steady rhythm of his breathing. They stayed like that until the first light touched the eastern peaks and the sky turned from black to violet to the pale gold of morning on the high country. Clara spoke. Her voice was hoarse from the cold and from the night of wrestling with a decision that would determine everything. I am going down, and I am coming back. Caleb nodded, one gesture. Inside that single movement lived everything he could not say. Trust that she was strong enough, fear that the world below would take her from him, and a promise unspoken but absolute that he would be standing in this exact spot when she returned. 3 days before the descent, the message arrived. It came through the network that connected the scattered families of the frontier's margins. Fur traders who traveled routes no map recorded. Runners who carried information between communities that the official world pretended did not exist. The message had originated with a dying man in a boarding house in Tucson, a man who had spent his final weeks and his final strength ensuring that the words reached their destination. Ezekiel Moss, 65 years old, Thomas Whitfield's personal servant for 3 decades, the man who had sewn the evidence into Clara's dress and been expelled from the ranch for his loyalty. He had written to Clara through intermediaries knowing he would not live to see whether the letter arrived. His handwriting was shaky with illness, but his words were clear. Look in the hem of the navy dress you wore the day they took you. I could not stop what happened, but I planted the seed that might undo it. Clara had kept the dress. It hung in the small room behind the kitchen, damaged beyond repair, but preserved through some instinct she had not understood until now. She brought it to Opal, and the old woman's experienced fingers worked the stitching with a patience that belied the urgency of the moment. Inside the hem, wrapped in wax cloth to protect against moisture, was a document, yellowed, water-stained at the edges. But the signature was unmistakably Thomas Whitfield's distinctive hand. The date preceded his marriage to Vivian Caldwell by 3 years. It was his will, clear and unambiguous, leaving the entirety of his estate to his daughter Clara Rose Whitfield, with provisions for his future wife only if she acted as faithful guardian to his child's interests until majority. There were notary seals, witness signatures from prominent Silver Creek businessmen, and most dangerous of all, detailed descriptions of property boundaries that matched the original territorial surveys. Not the modified versions Vivian had filed with corrupted officials. Clara held the document in her hands and felt its weight. Not the physical weight of paper. The weight of her father's love reaching across death to protect her. The weight of Ezekiel Moss's loyalty sewn into fabric with trembling hands by candlelight. The weight of truth, which in a just world should be the heaviest thing there is. Armed with this document, she prepared to descend. The journey down from Stone Mountain was not a retreat, but a procession. Deliberate, ceremonial, measured in its pace like a military column advancing toward a battle it intended to win. Caleb led. His horse moved with the controlled power of an animal that reflected its rider's absolute certainty of purpose. Josiah rode to Clara's left, his amber eyes sweeping the trail and the surrounding forest with the same attention he gave to wilderness. Every shadow evaluated, every open space assessed, every potential threat cataloged and filed. His silence was no longer the cold distance of a man withholding trust. It was the silence of a guardian, a protector who had decided that the woman riding beside him was family and who would kill without hesitation to defend that designation. Emmett rode to Clara's right, and for the first time since she had known him, his face carried no trace of its usual warmth. The easy expression that had made him the most approachable of the 3 brothers had hardened into something angular and fierce. His jaw was clenched. His amber eyes held a cold light that Clara had never seen in them before. The transformation from the Emmett who told stories by the fire to the Emmett who was prepared for war spoke to the townspeople more loudly than any verbal threat. Because a naturally gentle man who has chosen violence is far more frightening than a naturally violent man who has simply continued doing what he has always done. Clara rode at the center of this formation. She wore a mixture of mountain clothing and settler garments, buckskin leggings beneath a dress that had been repaired and reinforced for travel. Her hair was braided in the practical style of a working woman. The turquoise stone that Opal had placed around her neck rested against her throat, marking her as someone protected by forces that transcended law and custom. She looked like what she was, a woman who belonged to 2 worlds and would bow to neither. They entered Silver Creek as the afternoon sun turned the town's single dusty street into a ribbon of liquid gold. The town's normal activity froze as if God himself had halted time. Women gathering water from the public well stopped mid-motion, their buckets suspended in air. Men lounging outside the saloon let their cards fall from nerveless fingers. Children playing in the alley between buildings ceased their shouting and simply stared, their mouths forming perfect circles of shock. The sight was unprecedented and terrifying. The lost Whitfield daughter, presumed dead or ruined beyond redemption, riding at the center of 3 stone devils who moved with the coordinated precision of a cavalry unit heading directly toward the magistrate's office with purpose that brooked no argument. Clara saw a recognition flash across familiar faces. The butcher who had always given her father fair weight on meat purchases. The seamstress who had sewn her childhood dresses. And there, stepping backward into the shadow of his own building rather than meet her eyes, Thaddeus Hartley. The banker. The man who held her father's duplicate will in his vault and had done nothing with it for over a year. His retreat into shadow told Clara everything she needed to know about his conscience. A man at peace with his choices does not hide from the consequences walking toward him on horseback. The magistrate's office sat at the end of the main street, a squat adobe building that had witnessed every legal transaction in Silver Creek's 15-year history. Judge Cornelius Ward was a practical man who understood that frontier justice was less about abstract law and more about maintaining the social order necessary for commerce and survival. He had approved Vivian's guardianship papers without excessive questioning, accepting her narrative of a stepdaughter gone wild with grief and requiring firm institutional control. Now he emerged onto his office's narrow porch, his face pale beneath his carefully maintained beard, watching an entirely different narrative approach on horseback. Caleb dismounted first. His movements were fluid and controlled, each action performed with the deliberate calm of a man who is most dangerous when he is most quiet. He positioned himself at the foot of the porch steps in a stance that was not overtly threatening, but communicated absolute physical confidence. He was the largest human being most of these townspeople had ever seen, and he knew it, and he used that knowledge the way a chess player uses a queen. Not aggressively, just present, just visible, just impossible to ignore. Josiah and Emmett took positions on either side of the building, creating an arc that was simultaneously protective and intimidating. No one would approach uninvited. No one would flee unnoticed. Clara dismounted last, deliberately slow, allowing every watching eye to see that she moved under her own power, that her body bore no marks of abuse or captivity, that her eyes were clear and her bearing was that of someone who had spent recent weeks being forged in fires hot enough to burn away everything except essential truth. She mounted the steps alone, her father's will clutched in one hand, and faced Judge Ward with a directness that made the older man visibly uncomfortable. In a voice that carried clearly down the entire length of the street, ensuring that every eavesdropper and every gossip and every citizen of Silver Creek could hear, she identified herself by her full legal name and stated her business. My name is Clara Rose Whitfield. I am the sole daughter and legal heir of Thomas Whitfield. I am here to present evidence that my stepmother, Vivian Caldwell Whitfield, has committed fraud, forgery, and attempted murder. I demand immediate investigation and restoration of my rightful property. The words fell into Silver Creek's main street like stones dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward through the gathered crowd. Whispers began. Heads turned. The social fabric of the town, which had accepted Vivian's version of events for over a year, began to develop cracks. Judge Ward's eyes flickered between Clara, the document she held, and the three massive men who waited with the patience of stone. His bureaucrat's mind was clearly racing through implications. If he dismissed Clara's claims outright, he risked the wrath of men whose physical capabilities were obvious and whose willingness to use them was equally apparent. If he acknowledged her claim, he admitted his own failure to detect obvious fraud and potentially implicated himself in Vivian's conspiracy through incompetence, if not active corruption. The door behind Ward opened, and Vivian Caldwell herself emerged. She had been summoned from her comfortable rooms at the Grand Hotel, where she had been holding court as the town's wealthiest widow, dispensing charity and opinion with equal generosity. She had dressed carefully for the role she intended to play. Severe black silk that spoke of mourning, though her husband had been dead for well over a year. A cameo brooch at her throat, an expression of shocked horror so perfectly calibrated that Clara almost admired its artistry. Vivian's hand went to her breast as she gasped out her stepdaughter's name. Her voice carried just the right note of maternal concern mixed with frightened confusion. The performance was exquisite, a masterwork of theatrical emotion designed to present to the audience of townspeople exactly what they expected to see. A loving stepmother overwhelmed with relief at the miraculous return of her lost child. But Clara had learned on the mountain to read beyond words to the signals that bodies cannot lie about. She saw the micro-expression of rage that flashed across Vivian's face before the mask of concern settled into place. A tightening around the eyes that lasted less than a second, but spoke volumes about the real emotion beneath. She saw the way her stepmother's gaze went immediately to the Stone brothers performing a threat assessment with the speed and efficiency of a military tactician. She saw the subtle gesture Vivian made toward the shadows at the edge of the crowd where Dalton Crane waited still nursing wounds from the mountain assault. Her stepmother's first instinct was not joy at a presumed dead daughter's survival. It was annoyance at a persistent problem that had failed to stay solved. Clara spoke then. Her words were measured and clear, designed for the public record and for the audience of townspeople who were gathering despite their fear of the Stone brothers' presence. She laid out the sequence of events in damning detail. Her father's death. The immediate changes Vivian had made to household and property. The suspicious documents with wrong dates and forged signatures. Her abduction under false pretenses and delivery to Stone Mountain, where the isolation and harshness were supposed to solve the Clara problem permanently. How she had been taken in by the Stone brothers, a family her own mother had befriended decades ago. How she had survived through labor and proof of value. How she had obtained documentation that revealed the full depth of her stepmother's betrayal. Throughout Clara's recitation, Vivian's face underwent a fascinating evolution. The initial mask of maternal concern morphed into wounded innocence, then righteous indignation, then something colder and more calculating. When Clara finished, Vivian's response was not denial but counterattack. She pointed out that her stepdaughter had been living among savages for months, that such an experience would naturally disorder any civilized woman's thinking, that the supposed will was obviously a forgery crafted by the Stonemen themselves, mountain criminals attempting to use a confused young woman as their instrument to seize white property and wealth. The accusations were elegant in their construction. They leveraged every prejudice and fear the frontier held about isolated mountain communities. They weaponized the assumption that a woman who had lived outside civilized society must be mentally compromised. They turned Clara's strength against her by reframing it as evidence of corruption. Judge Ward shifted uncomfortably on his porch. The argument had a certain logic to it, however fraudulent, and he could see several townspeople nodding along. The prejudice against the Stone family ran deep. 20 years of rumor and fear could not be overturned by one woman's testimony, however compelling. Then Ward asked a question that shifted the entire dynamic. He looked at Vivian with the careful neutrality of a man trying to find safe ground in a situation where none existed. He said that Mrs. Whitfield claimed her stepdaughter was mentally disordered. But the young woman had just presented an argument more articulate and more precisely structured than any testimony he had heard in his 15 years on the bench. How did Mrs. Whitfield explain that contradiction? Vivian faltered. For the first time in Clara's memory, the woman who controlled every conversation she entered was momentarily without a script. She stammered that lucidity could be faked, that the mountain savages had coached and trained the girl. Clara seized the opening with the instinct of a debater's daughter. If these three men, she said, living alone on a mountain, possessed the ability to train a woman to speak like a lawyer, then perhaps they were not the savages her stepmother claimed. And if they were not savages, then the reason Vivian sent Clara to them was not protection. It was elimination. The murmur that passed through the crowd was like wind through dry grass. Clara's logic was simple, devastatingly simple. The kind of simplicity that cuts through complexity the way a sharp knife cuts through rope. Either the Stone brothers were ignorant brutes incapable of rational discourse, in which case sending Clara to them was an act of cruelty, or they were intelligent men capable of sophisticated thought, in which case calling them savages was a lie. Vivian could not have it both ways. Vivian tried again. Her voice tightened with controlled fury. This girl was always unstable. My husband worried about her before he died. Clara's response was immediate and devastating in its quietness. My father was worried, she said, but not about me. Silence. Every eye in the crowd moved between the two women like spectators at a duel waiting for the next shot. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, each side marshaling arguments, while the magistrate squirmed between competing pressures except for an intervention from a source that no one anticipated. Thaddeus Hartley stepped out of the shadows. The banker. The man who had tried to avoid Clara's gaze when she rode into town. The man who had been carrying the weight of a dead man's trust in his vault for over a year, hoping that circumstance would resolve itself without requiring him to choose between his conscience and his personal safety. He cleared his throat. The sound was thin and nervous, the sound of a man whose courage was smaller than his guilt, but whose guilt had finally grown large enough to overcome his fear. He announced that he had been Thomas Whitfield's personal banker, that he held in his vault several documents Thomas had deposited for safekeeping, including a duplicate will identical to the one Clara now held. The revelation struck the gathered crowd like lightning hitting a church steeple. Murmurs became exclamations. Heads turned sharply. The narrative that Vivian had constructed so carefully, the story of a disordered girl manipulated by mountain criminals, developed a crack so large that the entire structure shuddered. Hartley continued his confidence, growing as the truth he had been suppressing for months found its way to the surface like water finding a crack in a dam. Thomas had updated his will after his diagnosis, knowing his time was limited. He had instructed the bank to release the duplicate only when Clara came to claim it or when suspicious circumstances arose regarding her welfare. Hartley had been waiting, watching, hoping that Vivian would simply honor her late husband's wishes rather than forcing him to choose between legal duty and the fear of crossing a woman who clearly had no boundaries. But seeing Clara alive and making her claim he could no longer remain silent without becoming complicit in fraud and murder. He produced from his coat pocket a letter, also in Thomas Whitfield's handwriting, dated 3 days before the will, explaining in lucid detail his concerns about his new wife's intentions and his desire to protect his daughter's inheritance from what he called, in those careful, precise words that Clara could hear in her father's voice, potential predation. Vivian's face went from pale to flushed as the trap closed around her. She tried one final deflection, insisting that Thomas had been senile in his final days, that the will was the product of fever dreams and manipulation by scheming servants. But the banker shook his head firmly. The letter predated the will by 3 days. The language was lucid, the concerns were specific, and the handwriting matched every other document Thomas Whitfield had ever signed in Hartley's presence across 15 years of business dealings. This was not a confused, dying man. This was a father who saw the future clearly and did everything in his power to protect his child from it. Then the second blow fell, and this one came from a direction even Clara had not anticipated. Dalton Crane stepped out of the crowd, not to defend Vivian, not to rescue his employer from the noose that was tightening around her carefully constructed fiction, but to save himself. Dalton was many things: a tracker, a hunter of men, a man comfortable with violence as a professional tool. But he was also a survivor. And survivors calculate odds with the cold precision of gamblers who know when the house always wins. He had watched the proceedings from the shadows. He had seen the duplicate will. He had heard the banker's testimony. He had watched the crowd's sentiment shift with the slow inevitability of a river changing course. And he had calculated that Vivian Caldwell was finished. If she went down, he went with her. Conspiracy to commit murder, assault, arson, a list of charges long enough to guarantee a rope around his neck in any territorial court. Unless he positioned himself on the right side of the collapse, Dalton produced a document of his own, a contract, signed by Vivian Caldwell in her own distinctive hand. The contract was specific in its language, using the phrase, "Ensure that Miss Whitfield does not return. Not fine, not rescue, not bring home safely. Ensure she does not return." The meaning was unmistakable. Vivian had put her murderous intent in writing, trusting that the recipient of those instructions would be dead or gone long before anyone could read them. She had underestimated Dalton Crane. He was a predator. But predators survive by knowing when to abandon a losing position. And a sign-in confession of murder was the kind of leverage that could buy a man his freedom if he presented it to the right authority at the right moment. The irony was exquisite. Vivian Caldwell betrayed by the very instrument she had hired to carry out her betrayal of Clara, the tool turning in the hand that wielded it. A circle of treachery closing with the precision of a well-made trap. Judge Ward, watching his own political survival play out in real time, made the calculation that preserved his position with the least damage to his career. He announced that given the serious nature of the allegations in the documentary evidence presented from multiple independent sources, he was ordering an immediate investigation into the legitimacy of all property transfers that had occurred since Thomas Whitfield's death. Vivian Caldwell was to be detained pending a full hearing. Clara Rose Whitfield was to be recognized as the legitimate heir, with standing to challenge all previous determinations. 2 junior officials approached Vivian. She did not resist. There was no point. The fiction she had constructed was collapsing around her like a house built on sand, and the audience that had sustained it, the townspeople who had smiled at her and accepted her charity and believed her story, now regarded her with the cold reassessment of people who realized they had been fooled and did not intend to be fooled again. As Vivian was led past Clara, she stopped. The two women faced each other across less than 3 feet of dusty porch. Clara in her mountain buckskin and repaired dress with turquoise at her throat and her father's will in her hand. Vivian in her black silk and cameo brooch with nothing left except the truth she had spent 2 years trying to bury. Vivian's pale gray eyes met Clara's cornflower blue ones, and in that moment all pretense fell away. The masks that both women had been wearing, the roles they had been playing, the careful constructions of identity that frontier life required, all of it dissolved in the space between their gazes. What Clara saw in Vivian's eyes was not the pure hatred she expected. It was something more complex and ultimately more human. Beneath the fury, beneath the calculation, beneath the cold determination that had driven Vivian to attempt murder, Clara saw fear. Not fear of prison or punishment, fear of poverty, fear of returning to the girl she had been in St. Louis after her father's bankruptcy, after her mother's death, after the world had stripped her of everything and shown her exactly how little mercy it reserves for women without means. Vivian had built her entire second life on a single foundation: the absolute refusal to ever be poor again. Every lie she had told, every document she had forged, every crime she had committed grew from that foundation. From the terror of a girl who had watched her mother die in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and despair, and had sworn with every fiber of her being that she would never, never, never end up in that place again. It did not excuse what she had done. Nothing could excuse attempting to murder a young woman whose only crime was standing between Vivian and financial security. But it explained her. It gave her depth beyond simple villainy. It made her human in a way that pure evil never is. Clara saw this truth and felt something beside hatred rise in her chest. Not forgiveness. Vivian had tried to kill her. That was beyond forgiveness in any practical sense. But understanding, a recognition that monsters are not born from nothing. They are created by circumstances they cannot control and choices they absolutely can. Vivian had faced terrible circumstances, and she had made terrible choices. The circumstances deserve compassion. The choices deserve consequences. Vivian spoke. Her voice was raw, stripped of performance, carrying the ugly honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose. He promised I would be protected. I lost everything once. I was not going to lose it again. Clara held her stepmother's gaze and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The moment did not require words. It required witness. And Clara bore witness to the full complexity of the woman who had tried to destroy her and found within that complexity not redemption, but comprehension. Then the officials led Vivian away, and Clara stood on the porch of the magistrate's office in Silver Creek, Colorado territory, and breathed the afternoon air that smelled of dust and horses and the distant sweetness of sage from the mountains above. She had won. The ranch was hers. The inheritance was restored. The truth had been spoken before witnesses and recorded in the language of law and institution. But winning felt nothing like she had expected it to feel. The Whitfield Ranch, when Clara returned to claim, it felt less like homecoming and more like visiting a museum of someone else's life. She walked through rooms that had once represented security. The leather chair where her father had read evening papers. The kitchen where ranch hands had gathered for coffee before dawn. The bedroom where she had dreamed innocent dreams about futures that would never arrive. All of it felt like a costume she had outgrown. Well made, carefully preserved, but no longer fitting the shape of the person she had become. She stood in her father's study, where the portrait of Eleanor had once hung before Vivian, burned it along with everything else, and she felt the absence of her mother's face like a physical ache. But she also felt something else, a pull, a gravitational force that had nothing to do with the walls around her and everything to do with the smoke. She could see rising from the eastern ridgeline, thin gray spirals against the pale sky, marking the location of a homestead on Stone Mountain, where people were waiting for her to come home. Clara managed the ranch's affairs for 2 months with the same efficiency her father had taught her. She reviewed accounts. She met with territorial officials. She signed documents that restored her legal identity, and confirmed her ownership of every acre Thomas Whitfield had built from dust and determination. She was thorough, incompetent, and organized and miserable in a way that she could not explain to anyone who had not experienced what she had experienced. Because every morning she woke in a feather bed and missed the sound of wind through pine boughs. Every evening she ate at a proper table with proper silverware and missed the taste of venison stew cooked over an open fire in a cast iron pot. Every night she lay in silence and missed the distant sound of Emmett's voice telling stories and the creak of Josiah's boots on the porch during his watch, and the steady presence of Caleb somewhere nearby, a gravity that she had grown so accustomed to that its absence left her feeling untethered, like a planet that had lost its sun. The solution, when it came, felt less like compromise and more like inevitability. She leased the ranch to a young family recently arrived from Texas, the Hendersons, a husband and wife with 3 children and eyes that held a particular hunger for land and opportunity that Clara recognized because she had seen it in her father's old photographs. The lease was generous in its terms, structured to give the family real stake in the success of the operation, with provisions for eventual purchase if they proved themselves good stewards. She kept a portion of the inheritance liquid, enough to facilitate trade relationships between the mountain communities and legitimate merchants in Silver Creek. She established a small trading post at the base of Stone Mountain, staffed by a former Whitfield ranch hand who was honest and fair and understood that the mountain people were not savages but customers. The territorial government, relieved to have a potential flashpoint resolved through commerce rather than cavalry, granted limited trading rights that gave Clara's ventures protection under mercantile law. It was imperfect, subject to the whims of changing administrations, always one incident away from revocation, but it represented something that had not existed before. A crack in the wall that separated the mountain communities from the world below. A proof of concept that economic integration might succeed where suspicion and force had produced only cycles of violence. On a morning when autumn first touched the high country with gold, when the aspen groves on the lower slopes had turned to flame, and the air carried the sharp, sweet smell of leaves surrendering to the season, Clara rode back toward Stone Mountain, carrying the last of her possessions that she had decided to keep. Caleb met her at the tree line. His horse moved parallel to hers, without discussion of direction or destination. They rode in comfortable silence, the kind that comes only after countless smaller silences have woven themselves into an understanding deeper than words can excavate. He looked the same, perhaps a bit thinner. The weeks of her absence had been hard on him in ways he would never articulate because Caleb Stone did not discuss his own needs with the same facility that he managed everyone else's. But Clara could read him now. She could see the relief in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw unclenched by degrees as the distance between them narrowed, the way his amber eyes kept returning to her face with an intensity that was no longer assessment, but something warmer, something that had been growing in the space between them for months and had reached a fullness that could no longer be contained by silence alone. The homestead had been partially rebuilt during her absence. The destroyed storage shed had been replaced with a new structure larger than the original. Additional families from the surrounding mountains had come to help, drawn by the story of a woman from the lowlands who had earned her place through action rather than blood, who had saved a child's life, who had thrown dynamite off a cliff to protect the vulnerable, who had ridden into Silver Creek flanked by stone devils and made the civilized world bend to the truth. Opal greeted Clara's return with a grunt that might have been approval or might have been simple acknowledgement that the universe had finally gotten something right. The old woman was more ancient now, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was finishing its contract with the earth. But her obsidian eyes were as sharp as ever, and when they met Clara's, they held a light that had not been there before. Satisfaction. The deep, quiet satisfaction of a woman who had lived long enough to see a debt repaid across generations. That evening, around the central fire, where decisions of consequence were made and stories worth remembering were told, the community formalized what had already become true through months of shared labor and shed blood. Caleb stood to speak. His voice carried the cadence of formal pronouncement, and though Clara had heard him speak many times in the quiet language of daily life, she had never heard this register. This was the voice of a man addressing history, recording something for the memory of those who came after. He spoke of circles closing, of debts paid across generations, of a woman named Eleanor who had carried food up a frozen mountain to save strangers, and of her daughter who had been carried to the same mountain by cruelty and had transformed that cruelty into something that looked from certain angles like grace. He spoke of the way ancestors sometimes guide what seems like accident toward pattern and purpose. He spoke Clara's name, both her given name and the name the mountain had given her, and he wove them together into a narrative that made them seem like two halves of the same word. The legal ceremony came later, conducted by the same Judge Ward who had presided over the hearing that restored Clara's inheritance. Clara Whitfield and Caleb Stone were married in a brief civil proceeding that the territory recognized. The paperwork was filed in triplicate and stamped with official seals that transformed a personal bond into institutional fact. But the real marriage had happened over months of shared labor and silent communication. It had been validated not by papers, but by the way they moved through the world as a unit rather than as separate entities. By the way his hand found hers in moments of danger. By the way she leaned into his presence the way a tree grows toward consistent sunlight. By the thousand small negotiations and accommodations and acts of trust that built over time, something stronger than any contract or any ceremony could create. That night, the door to their room closed softly behind them. And when morning came, everything had changed between them, in the way that things change when two people who have earned each other's trust finally allow themselves to be fully known. Clara woke to the sound of wind through the pine boughs and the warmth of Caleb's arm across her shoulder, and understood with a certainty that required no analysis that she had arrived at the destination she had been traveling toward since the moment she stepped off that wagon alone in the forest and chose to walk uphill instead of lying down to die. 5 years passed. The territory remembered the day Clara Whitfield rode into Silver Creek, flanked by stone devils, as the moment when the old certainties began to crack. The legal proceedings that followed had been almost anticlimactic once the evidence was assembled. Vivian Caldwell was convicted of fraud forgery and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to 12 years in a territorial prison. Some said she would not survive the full term. Others said that Vivian Caldwell was too stubborn to die anywhere except on her own schedule. Clara did not visit her. There was nothing left to say between them that had not already been said on that porch in Silver Creek, in the silence between two women who understood each other perfectly and could never be reconciled. Clara learned in the years that followed that building bridges between worlds was not romantic adventure, but grinding daily work that required patience, sometimes indistinguishable from endurance. She spent weeks negotiating with suspicious merchants in Silver Creek. Weeks more explaining to skeptical mountain families why trading with the world below was not betrayal but strategy for survival in a world that would not stop encroaching regardless of anyone's wishes. She failed as often as she succeeded. Watching deals collapse over misunderstandings that no amount of goodwill could bridge. Watching potential allies retreat behind walls of prejudice that felt as permanent as the granite peaks themselves. But there were victories too, small and incremental, but real. A family of settlers who traded fairly and learned enough about mountain ways to conduct negotiations directly demonstrating respect through the effort of understanding. A merchant in Silver Creek who discovered that Stone Mountain furs were the finest quality in the territory and began paying premium prices that reflected their actual worth. A territorial official who visited the homestead expecting savages and left having had the best elk stew of his life in a conversation about land management that challenged every assumption he had brought with him up the trail. Tobias Brennan, the boy whose broken leg had been the turning point of Clara's acceptance, grew into a young man with a gift for languages and mathematics. Clara taught him everything her father had taught her about accounting and inventory management and the art of reading a contract to find the lie hiding between the clauses. She watched with fierce pride as he grasped concepts that would allow him to navigate both worlds with confidence. He would never be fully accepted in the society of Silver Creek, but he would not be cheated, would not be dismissed as an ignorant mountain boy whose word could be broken without consequence. That kind of practical empowerment felt more valuable to Clara than any idealistic vision of perfect harmony that ignored the actual dynamics of power and survival. On an evening 5 years after Clara first arrived on Stone Mountain, she sat with Caleb on the flat rock overlooking the valley below. The sunset was painting impossible colors across the canyon walls. Gold and crimson and a deep violet that existed nowhere else on Earth except in the sky above the Colorado high country at the exact moment when the day surrenders to the night. Josiah was on watch. He was always on watch. 25 years of guarding this homestead had not diminished his vigilance, though the things he now guarded had expanded far beyond 3 orphaned brothers and a granite-willed grandmother. He guarded a community, families, children who played in the meadow below the homestead and did not know what fear tasted like because men like Josiah stood between them and the darkness. Emmett's voice drifted from the cookhouse telling a story to the children gathered around his fire. His voice had lost the tremor that had marked it in the months after the battle. The question he had asked Clara beside the smoking ruins, "Am I the same as them?" had been answered not by philosophy, but by the daily accumulation of acts that proved the difference between a man who uses violence to protect and a man who uses violence to take. Emmett had found his peace, not through forgetting, but through purpose. Clara thought about her father. She wondered whether Thomas Whitfield had somehow foreseen this path when he preserved those duplicate wills. When he married Eleanor, a woman whose heart recognized kinship across every boundary that society constructed to keep people apart. She thought about Eleanor, the mother she barely remembered, the woman who had climbed a frozen mountain, carrying life inside her body to bring life to strangers. And she wondered whether genetics carried forward not just the shape of eyes and the color of hair, but inclinations of spirit, a tendency towards seeing humanity in unexpected places, a refusal to accept that the walls between worlds were as permanent as the people who built them believed. The child sleeping in the house behind her stirred and murmured in dreams, a daughter who would grow up belonging to multiple worlds, or perhaps to none of them, forging her own identity from the complicated inheritance her parents had given her. Clara felt the weight and privilege of that responsibility, understanding that the choices she made now would ripple forward through time in ways she could not fully predict or control. She had not found a simple happy ending, because such things did not exist in a place and time where violence and beauty existed in such intimate proximity, where every gain came edged with loss, and every alliance required constant tending. But she had found something more valuable than simple happiness. She had found purpose. She had found people worth standing with, even when standing was difficult. She had found in herself reserves of courage that her younger self could not have imagined possessing. The Stone brothers called her Starlight, not for romance, but for the sudden illumination she brought to dark problems, for the way she could cut through complications with unexpected solutions, for the quality of light she carried that refused to be extinguished no matter how deep the darkness surrounding it. Her father would have appreciated the name. He would have recognized in it the business acumen and the moral clarity he had worked so hard to instill. But it was the Stone brothers who gave it, who looked beyond her porcelain skin and her silk dress and her city manners to see capacities she had not known she possessed until circumstances demanded their emergence. Caleb's arm came around her shoulders as full darkness settled over the mountains, pulling her close against the night's chill. Their daughter's breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of true sleep. Josiah's boots made their quiet circuit on the eastern watch. Emmett's story had ended, and the children had been carried to bed by their mothers, and the homestead had gone still, except for the sounds that the mountain always made. Wind through pine boughs, water over stone, the distant call of a nightbird claiming its territory. The future was uncertain. It was always uncertain on this mountain. But uncertainty, Clara had learned, was not the same thing as fear. Uncertainty was simply the honest acknowledgement that tomorrow had not been written yet, and that the people who wrote it would be the people who showed up, who did the work, who stood their ground when the wind blew wrong and the fire came and the world tried to convince them that the things they had built were not worth defending. Clara Whitfield, Starlight, daughter of Thomas and Eleanor, wife of Caleb, sister to Josiah and Emmett, granddaughter in every way that mattered to Opal Stone, who had looked at a soft girl in a dusty dress and seen beneath the silk and the tears and the trembling, something made of the same material as the mountain itself. She was exactly where she belonged. Her stepmother had intended cruelty, but she had accidentally delivered grace, had thrown Clara into circumstances that revealed truths about strength and belonging that a comfortable life would have kept forever hidden. The desert had sharp edges, and Clara had been cut, but those cuts had revealed what she was made of. And what she was made of was the same thing the mountain was made of: stone, patient and enduring and permanent and strong enough to hold up the sky. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful in their constancy. And Clara felt for perhaps the first time in her life completely at peace with who she had become. Not because the struggle was over, but because she finally understood that the struggle was the point. That purpose was not a destination, but a daily choice. That love was not a feeling, but an action repeated every morning in the decision to stand beside the people who stood beside you. The wind shifted, carried the scent of pine and cold stone and the faintest ghost of smoke from the evening's fire. Somewhere on the mountain, an elk called to its mate across a distance that would have seemed impossible to bridge. But the call went out anyway. And somewhere in the darkness, an answer came back. It always does, for those who are patient enough to listen and brave enough to climb.